So first off, I want to thank Dee for having me here today to talk to you guys, and I want to thank you for coming on a Saturday morning at 10 a.m. To hear me talk about the future of publishing, which is awesome because I'm not even usually awake myself at 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. So I just wanted to give a brief introduction and tell you a bit about my background. My name is Sanders Kleinfeld, and my title at O'Reilly Media is Publishing Technology Engineer, and I work in Adam Whitwer's tools development group looking and dealing with these questions every day about what the future of publishing looks like. And I've been at O'Reilly for a fairly long time now. I started in 2004, straight out of college. And like Adam, I came from a humanities background. I was an ethics and political philosophy major in college, and I've always loved books, and I've always loved computers and technology. So even though I focused very heavily on literature and philosophy classes in college, I've always loved tinkering on the web, doing programming and stuff in my spare time. And why I was so excited to come work for O'Reilly is I could sort of marry those two loves together, both technology and book publishing. And I think what I'm most excited about and what I love most about my job is figuring out how we can take lessons that people have learned in the realm of programming and tech and publishing on the web and bring them to do next generation book content and ebook content. And I think there are so many lessons to be learned about that. And I think that a lot of times people see these two sectors as being so disparate, publishing and tech. Programmers and people who like reading books, people who like reading code and people who like reading books. But I think there's so much to be learned from combining those two disciplines. And that's what I want to talk about today. And when I was first thinking about how to put together this presentation and put together these slides, I was really, really overwhelmed, to be honest. I was like, there's so much cool stuff happening in tech. There's so much exciting stuff happening in publishing. How do I even condense this? How do I even talk about this? And what I finally realized was like, what I wanted to answer today, or what I wanted to attempt to answer today, was one very, very specific question, which is, how do you write a book? And by that, I don't mean I mean it very literally. I don't mean how do you think about ideas? How do you come up with a thesis? How do you come up with something really worthwhile to say? How do you overcome writer's block? I don't have answers for those kinds of questions today, and I'm not going to tackle those kinds of questions today, and I'm sure there are plenty of authors who would love to talk about those kinds of questions ad nauseum. I mean it very, very literally. I mean, how do you actually write a book? And in terms of conceptualizing this for myself, I thought I would take a look back at the history of how do you write a book. So back in 1776, I think the answer was really, really simple, right? You took your quill and you took your little inkwell there, and you just sat there and you took open a blank codex and you just started literally like taking pen to paper and writing and writing and writing. And as technology has evolved, the means for writing a book has evolved as well. So if you ask the same question in, say, 1890, maybe you have a typewriter now, and you're banging out on keys on the keyboard. But I want to fast forward quickly to today. And I think this is probably how most of you, it's getting a little stretched. I'm sorry about that. The aspect ratio is a little off. I think this is how most of you write today. So those are screenshots from Microsoft Word. And this may look really familiar to you. That's O'Reilly's specific Word template. So we have our own Word template for putting together book content, and that comes with all kinds of special tags and macros. So I have a few little pop-up windows there where you can see little pieces of all that stuff. So I think this is basically what people are doing today when they're writing books, most authors and most publishers. Publishers provide a template, or they tell authors to just go into Microsoft Word and type in some words, and you get all the advantages of a modern word processor. You get spell check, you get margin formatting, you get bold, italic, all kinds of stuff. It's way better than using a typewriter. But it's what's been being done, I think, for maybe the past 20 years. People have been using Word really heavily since the 90s, I think. And what I'm really interested in answering the question is, what are we going to do in 2013? Is Word going to continue to be the preeminent way that people write books? Is Word meeting publishers' needs? Is Word meeting authors' needs? And I hope to answer that question today in just talking through some of the issues I found and see what you think and hopefully get you to reconsider some of the ways that people write books and how you should write a book. And I think part of the problem here is that this really, really simple question, how do you write a book, has suddenly become really, really problematized in about the past 5 to 7 years. Because you're not really asking, how do you write a book? You're now asking, how do you write a book? Because the whole concept of a book is really in flux right now. And I'm very fortunate to have Adam go before me and talk a lot about what books look like today and what books should look like in the future. But to sum up really quickly in 2 slides, in 1826, this is what a book looked like, right? You knew what a book was. It was a bound together set of pages with printing on them. In 2012 already, the concept of what a book is very, very, very much more malleable. So in 2012, this is a book. That's a copy of O'Reilly's Learning Python, the print copy. But this is also a book. That's the same actual content on an e-ink Kindle device. And this is also a book. This is the same version of Learning Python, but this time it's on a color tablet, an iPad. And this is also a book. This is the same book yet again, the same content on an iPhone. And this is also a book here too, right? So this is the same version of the book on Safari Books Online, which is an online subscription library of tech book content and also business book content, which O'Reilly is a partner in. So that's one way of looking at books on the web. Safari Books Online is doing that. So I was thinking about it, I'm like, wow, basically at this point everything's a book, right? Well, not everything, but it really is become an issue where the concept of a book has become really, really malleable. So instead of asking, how do you write a book, in quotes, I think the question you're really asking at this point is, how do you write an ebook with the E in parentheses? How do you write something that's a print book or an ebook, using the term ebook to sort of encompass all those different varieties of digital formats? So I'm like, okay, great. Now I've got the question here. How do you write an ebook? But I started thinking about it some more, and I realized the question is still a little more complicated than that. And I'm going to put the word write in quotation marks too, because I think that the act of writing has now become really problematized too in a digital world. So I wanted to come up with an example of what I mean by that. So what I did is I created a slide called Anatomy of an ebook, and an EPUB in specific. So this is chapter 1 of that book, Learning Python, that I showed you the screenshots of in a previous slide. And on the left is what you see on the iPad. So that's how the book renders and all that great stuff. But what's really inside is what you see on the right, which is HTML. And the HTML has a reference to CSS, and that's what controls what actually displays on your iPad. So this is what's in the guts of it. Which brings me to something I'm calling an inconvenient truth, which is ebooks are made of code. If you are an ebook publisher, you are in the software development business. Like it or not, all of a sudden you're developing software. And I think people sort of subconsciously realize that right now, but I don't think they've really fully thought through the implications of that or really, really understand what that means for their business. Basically, their business has changed out from under them. So going back to my initial question, how do you write an ebook? I don't think you write an ebook anymore. I think you develop an ebook in the same way that a software developer develops a code package or develops an application, I should say. So now that we have our question, I wanted to come up with, there we go. I wanted to come up with principles that really apply when you're developing a modern ebook. So I've sort of distilled it into what I think are the 6 most important principles that go along with that. And I'm going to go through each one in more detail, but I wanted to outline them first because this is what I'm going to spend most of my time talking about. So the first key principle, I think, of developing a modern ebook is, number 1, WYSIWYG is a thing of the past. So WYSIWYG, I think, is a very popular term in web development circles and programming circles, but for those of you who aren't familiar with it, it's an acronym that stands for what you see is what you get. And I think I'm going to talk about this in more detail, but I think publishers for a really long time have been operating in a WYSIWYG model, and I don't think that applies anymore. The second thing I'm going to talk about is the fact that semantic markup matters. And I'm going to talk in more detail about what I mean by semantic markup, but just in more general terms, I mean marking up and identifying the sections of your book in a way that's meaningful, that has to do with what they are rather than how they should be formatted. The third thing I want to talk about is single source, multiple outputs. I think that it's really, really important as we start talking about the fact that we are publishing content into all these different channels and all these different formats. There needs to be a single source to make that happen in a really sane way. And the fourth thing I want to talk about is automation and what I'm calling automate your headaches away. The fact that we now live in we live in modern times, we have modern technology and modern tools. We need to start using them in smart ways in publishing to automate a lot of the processes that in the past have been done very manually. The fifth thing I want to talk about is versioning is the new spell check. And I'll talk more about what I mean about that a little bit later on. But basically, I want to talk about how we version and control different stages of development of the book process. And the last thing I want to talk about is something that Adam hit on a lot in his talk, and I hope to follow up on it a little bit. New medium equals new dimensionality. An ebook is a very, very different thing than a print book. It has different dimensions. There are different possibilities about what you can do with it. And what I want to do is very lightly touch on some of those possibilities. So I'm going to go through these sections one by one, and I'm going to give an overview of each one. But because this is a workshop, after I'm done, I really want to hear what you guys think about these different areas. I want you to tell me what you'd like to hear a little bit more about, and I can go into depth on any of them. So I wanted to skip doing live demos during this portion where I go over each one, because I found switching back and forth between slides and demos can waste a lot of time and be a little bit disconcerting. So I have some cool demos of all this stuff that I can show you at the end, depending on your interest in different topics. But I first want to go through each 6 of these in a little bit more detail. So number 1, WYSIWYG is a thing of the past. So I talked about this just a minute ago, but again, WYSIWYG is what you see is what you get. And I thought the best way to really explain that was to illustrate it really simply. So I picked an O'Reilly book, and I'm picking O'Reilly books for most of my examples, not because I'm trying to promo them too much, although that's a nice side effect, but it's largely because I just had access to all the book files for all these titles, and I had access to PDFs and source files and all that stuff. So these are screenshots from a book called Head First Algebra, which is a book that uses graphical elements to teach students algebra. And on the left side, you'll see the opening page of Chapter 1 in Adobe InDesign. And if you look on the PDF on the right, that's a screenshot of the PDF on the right. It looks exactly the same. So it seems like a really obvious point, but what I'm trying to say here is that you sit there in InDesign and you decide exactly how you want it to look, and then you output it to a PDF, and it looks exactly that way. What you see is what you get. And when a customer buys that print book or opens that PDF, they're going to see exactly that. And you know it's going to look exactly that way. And this may be a really obvious point, but what I want to say and just reiterate is WYSIWYG is perfect for print because every single print copy of the book is the same. Or it should be the same. I can't account for printer errors. It's possible that all kinds of crazy things can happen in the manufacturing process. But you are operating on the assumption that assuming all goes well, every single print copy of the book is the same. And that means that if I buy a copy of that book, if you buy a copy of that book, if somebody in France buys a copy of that book, they're getting the same book. And you say, if you look at this page, you're going to see the exact same thing. Sorry, skipped a slide there. So 2 simple reasons that WYSIWYG really fails for ebooks is, number 1, that rendering is device dependent. And what I mean by that is that there are a lot of devices out there. So one person may have an Amazon Kindle that's an e-ink reader that's just black and white. Another person may have a Kindle Fire, which is basically a small Android tablet that can display color stuff and also potentially video or audio content. Another person may have an iPad. Another person may have a phone with a really small screen. Another person may, be wanting to look at stuff on their desktop computer. There are a lot of different devices out there. And the other thing is that rendering is user customizable. And this is arguably either the best thing or the worst thing about the ebook revolution, depending on who you are and what side of the coin you're on. If you're a ebook customer, you love the fact that on your Kindle you can change the font size of the text. I think this has been talked about a lot, but there are a lot of people out there that love buying ebooks because they used to have to try and find the large print versions of a print book. And now they don't need to do that. They can just take that ebook file and they can crank the font size up. Or potentially maybe they want to crank the font size down and fit more on a page, or change the font. There's a lot of ability to customize. So it's no longer a situation where the design comes on high down from the publisher and is given to you, and that is what you must accept. Power has been put back into the hands of the consumer. So to illustrate that, I just wanted to illustrate each of these points really quickly. So this is what I mean by device-dependent rendering. On the left is an example of a book called Getting Started with Processing. Processing.js is a JavaScript library for doing all kinds of cool animations and visualization type stuff on the web. So this is an example of that shows how to make owls. And on the left, you'll see how this content renders on an e-ink device. So you can see it's black and white, and the fonts are a little bit different. On the right is the same page basically, and again I'll put page in quotation marks I guess because there's no concept of page in a reflowable device. The same instance of text on the iPad. And that's a color tablet, so we can do all kinds of cool stuff like put the images in color. That image is actually in black and white, so that's why it's still in black and white. But the code is now in color. The headings are now in color. We can do all kinds of cool stuff that way. So you can see how the concept of the design is really problematized when you don't know whether the person who's going to be looking at your design has color or not. In a print book, the book is either printed in color or it's not printed in color. And there's no device that's needed to read it to determine whether or not the color is seen or not. So that's device-dependent rendering. And I want to show you an example of user customizable rendering. So this is actually not an O'Reilly book. This is an example of Hamlet I pulled. I grabbed the EPUB version of Hamlet from Project Gutenberg, and I pretended I was a publisher. And since I have very little in the way of design skills, I didn't do anything very fancy. But I styled it how I would like to see Hamlet styled on my iPad. So this is an example of how the publisher may intend this content to be displayed. But because content is user customizable, maybe this is actually how the reader wants this content displayed. So I cheated a little bit. I pulled in a ransom note font, which is actually not part of your choices on the iPad. So if a reader actually wanted to do this in themselves, they would have had to go to a lot of trouble, which I did, to get a ransom note font and embed it in the EPUB and then redisplay it like that. But I couldn't help myself from doing it. And I wanted to make a really stark point in how I illustrated this, which is that users can do whatever they want. And maybe someday, or maybe some device, will have a ransom note font. And you have to deal with the fact that somebody wants to read it this way. So I think this is a real design problem. It's like how do you do design anymore when users can do whatever they want with your stuff, or users can read it on a device that doesn't support these elements of design? And does that mean that design is a thing of the past? I don't think it does. So I wanted to show you guys a quote from Craig Maude, who is really at the he used to work at Flipboard, and now I believe he's independent. He's a really brilliant guy, and I encourage everybody to go to, if you're interested in design, to go to craigmaude.com and check out his website. He did this book called Art Space Tokyo, which a colleague of mine at O'Reilly actually worked on with him. And there's a great post talking about how they did this book, but they decided they wanted to take this print book about art galleries and really brilliant, cool, artsy stuff in Tokyo and turn it into an ebook. And they wanted to make a beautiful ebook for Kindle, and they wanted to make a beautiful ebook for iPad. And they were really butting up against the limitations of the technology and what you could do. And I think Craig really epitomized his ethos in this quote about how to actually do design in this kind of world. And he said, "The goal isn't to perfectly replicate the print edition. It is to take the design cues and layout ethos of the print edition and bring it to digital in as unaffected a way as possible. To draw a line connecting the digital and physical editions without compromising either experience." So I think what that means is that there's an underlying style that is really represented and brought out in the print book. And you need to figure out what that is. Maybe it's the font that's used in the headings. Maybe it's the way that images are put in a box or something like that. You have to figure out what is sort of like the epitome of your style and what you want to convey through style in your book. And you have to figure out a way to translate that to the web. It doesn't mean, I think there's been a real trend towards fixed layout in ebooks, which is basically an attempt to take WYSIWYG and put it on a device. And I think that's been really problematic because the only way to do that successfully has really been to assume all your customers are reading that one specific device. So I think what a lot of publishers have done and said, okay, we're going to target the iPad, and we're going to take our print book, and we're going to make it look exactly the way we want it to look like on the iPad. And I think that's problematic for a couple reasons. One, I think it really doesn't tackle this question. It sort of basically is kicking the can down the road and not really thinking about what it means to design for digital. And I think, too, it's really, really limiting your customer base. Not everybody can afford an iPad. Not everybody chooses to have an iPad. Why would you want to deny the people who have chosen to have a Kindle instead, or maybe just want to look at a book on the web, the experience to see your digital book? It gets into those issues of fragmentation that I think Adam summed up really eloquently, which is that there's so many different formats, there's so many different devices. You know, do you really want your choice be to pick one and bet on that and hope all of your customers will buy it that way? I don't think that's the way. I think Craig Maude's suggestion is the way forward, which is to really rethink what design means. So that's my full section on design for now. And like Adam, I should have given the caveat at the beginning that I'm really, really not a designer. I know CSS, but I have no design skills, so I'm not very good at it. But I think the general principles are really salient here. So I want to move into an area that I think is more of my personal purview and knowledge base, which is semantic markup. And the fact that now more than ever, semantic markup really, really matters. So the way I wanted to introduce semantic markup was that I wanted to show you guys a first chapter of my memoirs. This is chapter 1 of my memoirs, and I'm calling it Autobiography of Me. And it looks like that's basically readable on screen, but I will read it to you because it's very short. I was born in 1980, I love chocolate ice cream, and I'm a wicked awesome writer, yo. So that's obviously how I would write that content in Microsoft Word in my 2012 workflow that I showed earlier. But that's, again, what you see on screen. And what I wanted to do is pick it apart a little bit, anatomize it, and show you the underlying representation of what Word is actually storing. So Microsoft Word supports XML, and they've created their own little XML flavor called Word XML. and they offer the ability, at least in Microsoft Office's latest versions, to basically export your Word file as XML, which is a data file that you could then open in any text editor. So I wanted to sort of break it open and show you what Word is storing for that simple first sentence of a chapter that I put together. So just to illustrate this even further, I'm going to go back and go forward again. So this is really this. So this is a big mess, so I tried my best to sort of parse it out for you. The stuff in bold is the actual text content. Everything else is related to formatting. So I tried to put a bunch of the key parts of the formatting together in orange, so you could just get little snippets of it and sort of ignore all the extra cruft. Cruft is sort of a program term for just extra junk. So in the first section in the upper right, you can see where I've just pointed out that the chapter heading and the chapter number were aligned right, so that's what that's saying there, in text aligned right. And then the second bit in the middle, which is really hard to see, maybe not that hard to see, W:I, that's the little bit in the middle there that says that the part that says wicked awesome is in italics. So that's where you have to find the part that says italic and all that big jumble. And at the end, which I thought was kind of crazy when I was looking at it, is that there's also tagging in there that gives you results of Word spell checker. The part that says proof error and the opening and closing tag for that is telling me that the word yo is not in Word's dictionary and is apparently a misspelling. So that's the kind of stuff that Word is storing in there. Word is storing all the formatting information. It's storing the results of its spell checker and all that kind of stuff. So I think this is really, really problematic. And I wanted to get into what I'm going to say are the three major problems with this XML, and I'm going to talk a little more about them. Number one, and this is the key thrust of this section, the markup is not semantic. The markup is only about describing the formatting. It doesn't say it doesn't say that this part is used for emphasis. It doesn't say that this part is a chapter title. It doesn't say any of that information. It just says this part is this size, this part is italic, this part is spelled wrong. Number two, it conflates content and presentation. And I think anybody who is a web developer understands that right off the bat. That a really key principle in modern web development and web programming is that you separate your content from its presentation. So when you design a website, you put together your HTML, which says what the content is, and then you use a separate set of rules called CSS to style that content. And by separating those two things out, you say, this is meaningful in terms of what it is, and this is meaningful in terms of how it's styled. So by doing that, you really separate those two things out, and you can change the style of a page without having to mess with the content. And the third problem is just yuck. This is really, really, really gross. And I was trying to think of an eloquent way to say it, and I think the point I'm trying to get here is you know when something's bad when you see it. You know this can't possibly be the right way to do things. And I think you just really need to, sometimes your gut instinct about this sort of stuff is really right. So I want to take a look into what the alternative to this kind of mess is. And I believe semantic markup offers a really great alternative. So semantic markup in a nutshell. And I think I said all this already, but semantic markup really describes the function of your content, not its formatting. So what semantic markup would say is this is a chapter heading, this is a section heading, this is a paragraph, this is a sidebar, this is a figure image. And it wouldn't say things like this text is in Garamond font, this text is 36 points, this text is bold, this text is center aligned. No, that's not semantic, that's formatting. Semantic is what it is. So I want to talk about two really key forms of semantic markup that O'Reilly is using in practice now to publish most of its books. to give you an idea of what these options are. So semantic markup option number 1 is DocBook XML. DocBook is a semantic XML markup vocabulary that was introduced in 1991. Fortunately for O'Reilly, who actually, I guess it's not so fortuitous considering O'Reilly was very deeply involved with developing the DocBook standard, DocBook markup was primarily designed for representing technical documentation. But it's also very well suited for representing any prose content. It's not great for doing things like poetry or drama, plays or screenwriting, because it doesn't have a lot of advanced stuff for dialogue or for formatting lines of poetry in very intricate ways. But any prose content, it's really wonderful for. If you're interested in learning more about DocBook, you can see the DocBook DTDs at that web link that I provided there. And there's a wealth of information on the website docbook.org, including O'Reilly's book, DocBook: The Definitive Guide, which is available for free as a web book on the site, so you can read it there. You can also get the ebook version or the print book version from O'Reilly.com. And I'm going to give you a brief taste of DocBook, but it's sort of outside the scope of my presentation today to really dive too deep into it. So here's an example of the DocBook representation of the book content. So I've taken that very same word chapter on the left and I've re-implemented it as DocBook XML. And maybe I'm just drinking the Kool-Aid, but I really, really feel that this XML markup is much more beautiful and much better to read and to parse and to understand than that Word XML I showed you a couple slides ago. So again, I've outlined in orange the different sections that are actually the tags used to semantically mark up the content. So what you'll see there at top is the very first 2 lines are the XML declaration and the doc type declaration. Those are standard things in XML that describe that this is an XML document and this is the flavor of XML that it is for validation purposes. But for everything from there on is the semantic markup of the document. So you'll see that because we're dealing with the chapter here, there's an opening chapter tag at the top and there's a closing chapter tag at the bottom. So this is saying this is where the chapter starts, this is where the chapter ends. It's saying that autobiography of me, that's the title of the chapter, and that it has a paragraph, and you'll notice that there's a tag emphasis that indicates which text should be emphasized. And I think a really, really important point here is that the tag is called emphasis, not italic. Italic describes a kind of formatting. Emphasis is semantic. It says this text should be emphasized. And then it leaves it up to the styling engine to determine what emphasis means. Depending on your book style, maybe you want emphasis to be in italic. And in fact, in most O'Reilly books, we do use italic for emphasis. But you can imagine that bold could be used for emphasis. Bold italic could be used for emphasis. Maybe you'd want text in a different color to emphasize it. By saying emphasis, you say what you want to happen, not how you want it to be styled. I think it's the difference between the HTML analog would be using the I tag, which is very web design 1995, I guess, versus using the M tag in HTML, which again indicates emphasis. So one thing that I wanted to really make a key point about is that just because you're working in XML does not mean you have to write all those tags manually yourself. So in fact, most of the people in O'Reilly's production department are not XML geeks. They're not super technical. They don't want to spend all day writing starting and ending tags, making sure they balance them properly, making sure the XML is valid. So they use these tools, and there are a lot of great graphical text editors that are sort of like what I'll say is, Word for DocBook. And 2 of the great ones are XMLmind XML Editor and Oxygen XML Editor. And I hope those URLs are readable, but if they're not, you could Google either of those applications and quickly get to their websites. So XMLmind has a personal edition, which is free, which you can use without any charge. If you're going to use it for commercial purposes, you have to purchase a license. Oxygen is a commercial piece of software, and you can download and get a free trial and try it out, but you will have to buy a license if you want to use it. I think they're both really great, And I think what's sort of clear from the screenshots are there aren't a whole lot of differences in the approach that they take. I think perhaps XMLMind, XML Editor, is a little more friendly to people who are used to Word because it makes an attempt to cover the basics really well and get really great graphical support for the basics. Oxygen is a real power users tool. So it lets XML geeks do all kinds of stuff that they're interested in doing. It has built-in support for things called schematrons, which let you validate XML. It has built-in support for XSLT, which is a transformation language that is used to transform XML from one format to another, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. But either of these are really great options for editing XML and hiding all the tagging and doing things very similarly to how you do it in Microsoft Word, but you have really cool structured semantic documents instead when you're done. But I don't want to imply that if you want to do semantic markup, you're really stuck with XML. Not everybody likes XML. And that's what we found at O'Reilly, that we had all these authors that said, I really don't like XML. You're telling me I have to write in XML? And we never said that to begin with. We still have a lot of authors that do prefer to work in Microsoft Word, and we will take their content and convert it to DocBook XML when we're done. But we had a lot of authors who didn't want to work in Microsoft Word, who didn't want to work in DocBook XML, and they basically came to us with the alternative that they wanted, which was something called AsciiDoc. So AsciiDoc is a lightweight wiki-like markup language for prose content. If you have edited a Wikipedia page, then you're probably familiar with wiki-like markup. It's a lot of symbols that aren't tags like HTML or XML, but are used to add styling to content. AsciiDoc specifically was created by Stuart Rackham in 2002. It's a completely free open source project. And the way the AsciiDoc toolchain works is that it is a bunch of scripts that are written in Python that rely heavily on text processing with regular expressions. And I'm going to get into in a couple slides what you can do with AsciiDoc. But to make it clear, I'm going to take that same chapter of my memoirs and convert it to AsciiDoc now. So this is the AsciiDoc representation of the book content. And you can see that there's a lot less markup and a lot less tagging, but you can do the exact same thing semantically. So there's actually only two elements of tagging in this entire section here. The first one is a double equal sign, which says that this is a chapter title, and that precedes Autobiography of Me in orange there. And AsciiDoc, the way it handles taking away a lot of all that extra semantic markup stuff is everything is implied. So by putting a chapter title there, you say, well, that's where the chapter starts. And then for emphasis, use underscores to surround those two words. So you start it with an underscore and you end it with an underscore. And that's how you do emphasis. And everything that is together as a paragraph block is considered to be a paragraph. So I don't need to add a para tag to start and a para tag to finish. So it's a lot simpler, and a lot of all the extra markup weight is taken away because that stuff is implied for you. So to pick a text editor with AsciiDoc support, I wanted to show you guys just a screenshot, and I can show you it in a little more depth later, of O'Reilly's new Atlas development platform, which is basically our attempt to make a next generation manuscript and publishing platform to replace either Microsoft Word or authors using tools like Oxygen or things like that. So our O'Reilly Atlas platform allows you to edit text and enter text in AsciiDoc format and edit it that way. And we have syntax highlighting built in, and we have all kinds of support, which I'm going to get into later, for building ebooks from it. But obviously this is an O'Reilly internal product, and an alternative would be basically any text editor that you use to edit documents can do AsciiDoc as long as you save as plain text. So a lot of our authors use a tool called TextMate, which is available for the Mac, and which comes with syntax highlighting packages that will highlight the AsciiDoc markup like I did on my previous slide. And basically, the great thing about AsciiDoc, if you want to write a Word document, you either have to use Word or a tool like OpenOffice which can read .doc files, doc files, which are words files, which are binary. Because ASCII-Doc is plain text and because DocBook XML is plain text, you can use any text editor to edit these documents. So I talked a lot about philosophically why semantic markup is important and what it looks like, but I think pragmatics are really what drives people. So the question I imagine some people are asking is, that's nice, but what's in it for me if I do all this stuff? I already use Microsoft Word. Why should I go in and deal with all this stuff? So I think the answer is that because you're using semantic markup, it opens up a whole lot of windows of what you can do with that content. Which is that with DocBook, there's these great projects that are surrounding DocBook called the DocBook XSL project, which is a series of XSLT style sheets, which I'm going to talk about a little bit more in a little bit, which basically enable you to take any DocBook content and output to all those formats that I've listed, which include PDF, EPUB2 or EPUB3, HTML, both HTML4 and HTML5. You can even output to Word via but basically converting DocBook to Word XML and then reopening that Word XML in your Word document. And you can even output to Keynote slides. No, I did not make this presentation in DocBook, but in theory I could have. And what can you automatically output ASCII-Doc to? Well, you can automatically output ASCII-Doc to DocBook. And what's really cool about that is if you can output ASCII-Doc to DocBook, then that opens all the doors that you have with DocBook. So you can start with ASCII-Doc, get your DocBook, and then do anything up top. But in addition to that, ASCII-Doc has out-of-the-box support for converting directly to HTML. Again, HTML4, HTML5. You can output to WordPress. If you were making a blog, you could use ASCII-Doc that way. And you could output to LaTeX. LaTeX is a formatting language. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it. I was not familiar with it until I started at O'Reilly. But LaTeX is a formatting language that is used very heavily by math and science and technology publishers, because it has great representations of things like equations and graphs and things like that. So a lot of math and science journals and books are laid out in LaTeX. And LaTeX is similar to tools like InDesign and FrameMaker, and that it's a formatting language. It says how stuff is formatted. It's not so much semantic. So what's exciting about taking ASCII-Doc and exporting it to LaTeX is you can mark up your content semantically and then push it out to a formatting language like LaTeX. So that's cool that you can automatically output to all these different formats, and that really leads me to the next point that I wanted to make, which was single source, multiple outputs. So before I get into that, I wanted to sort of do a snapshot of what I think a lot of different publishers' workflows look like right now. And I'm calling this place Conversion City. And Adam talked in his previous talk about the rise of the conversion vendor, and I hope this helps contextualize that even a little bit more. So I think what a lot of publishers' workflows look like right now is that they start with a Word document. And I doubt very many publishers are actually producing their PDFs directly from Word, because that's not what Word was designed for. It's a word processor. So they'll take those Word documents and they will convert them to Adobe InDesign so they can do all kinds of exciting, awesome, fancy layout for the print book. And then they've got their InDesign file complete. And then they're like, oh, okay, we can create the print book right from those InDesign files. But what about the other digital formats? We want to get this book into the Kindle store. Okay, so we need to make an EPUB for Apple iBooks and for Google, and we need to make a Mobi for Amazon's Kindle store, and then maybe we want to make a special web PDF to sell elsewhere. So conversion, conversion, conversion. And then the author decides they want to write the next edition of the book. And you have all this proofreads edits that have been done in the InDesign files, not in the source Word files. So you want to give the author back the proofed and edited version of his text so that he can edit for the second edition and not make the same mistakes the second time over. So you have to take those InDesign files and you convert them back to Word. And then the Word files are converted back to InDesign. And the process repeats and repeats and repeats. Conversion, 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 conversion. And most likely you hire a vendor to do all these steps because it's just a lot of steps and it's a lot of time. So you outsource it. That's Conversion City. But what I want to advocate instead is what I'm calling the single source model. And what that means is there is one set of source files. All edits are made to one set of files. You take the doc book. The author writes in the doc book. He writes his book in doc book. He hands it to our production staff. The production staff does all of their editing in doc book. They proof the doc book. The indexer adds indexing tags to the doc book. The author goes back into the doc book and makes final edits in the doc book himself or herself. Everything happens in the doc book. And when time comes to make a print book or a web PDF or an HTML version or a MOBI or an EPUB, you do not do a conversion. You do a transformation. You take that content and you run it through a tool chain and you produce those outputs. So basically, instead of having a bunch of arrows going in all different directions, take it from here to here to here, and then back to here, everything is at the core in the source, and everything radiates out from the source. So I wanted to really go point. I think this is really important, and I'm really, really a strong advocate of this model because I've seen how wonderful it's been for our own internal staff because we've been using it ever since 2006 really, really heavily. And Adam talked about that story about how people came to him and suggested XML was the way forward. And here are the reasons why I really feel like this single source model matters and works really well. Because all authoring and edits are made to just one set of files, there is no need to maintain multiple sets of files. One set of files is it, and you are done. Outputs are produced by transformations and not conversions. And I worried that this was basically me just playing a little bit of a semantic game here. What's the difference between a transformation and a conversion? This is my definition of the difference. Transformations are automated, fast, infinitely repeatable, and do not require cleanup afterwards. So what that means is you take that docbook content, and in our tool chain, what we then do is we run a script called db to PDF on that docbook content, and it spits out a PDF that is final and print ready. So basically, our production staff will make edits to that XML content, run db to PDF, get a PDF, take a look at it, make more edits to the XML, run db to PDF again. They can run it as many times as they want. It's fast, it's repeatable, and there's no cleanup required afterwards. I think one of the biggest problems of Conversion City is that you send stuff out to a conversion vendor or you try and export it using InDesign's conversion tool to take it to EPUB, and what you come out in the end is something that's 85% of the way there. Or maybe you're more lucky and it's 90% of the way there. Or maybe you're even more lucky and it's 95% of the way there. How many additional hours of work does it take you to get the additional 5%? To take that EPUB you exported from InDesign, crack it open, and make 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 edits to it and finish it up. And let's say it only takes you 10 minutes to do it. And you're like, well, great, my model is really great. I do something in InDesign, I export it to EPUB, I spend 30, 15, 20, however many minutes cleaning it up, and then we're good to go. Except, oh wait, there were some last minute changes that need to be made to the InDesign files. You go back to the InDesign files, you make those edits again, you export the EPUB again, and guess what? You have to spend those 30 minutes again. And this happens 4 times because there were 3 last minute printer emergencies. You've just wasted 2 hours. In a single source model, you make those edits to the source, you generate your outputs, you do not have to touch your outputs. So you go back to the source again, you regenerate, you push a button, you push a button, you push a button, no cleanup afterwards. And I think the last point that is why the single source model is really great is it's extensible. As Adam's shown, like there are new formats that are cropping up every day. Amazon gives you no notice, and then all of a sudden they're like, now we want you to do KF8. It's a new version of the MOBI format. Apple comes out with a new iBooks author format. Instead of trying to figure out how to rejigger your workflow to accommodate all these different new formats, you just have to figure out a new transformation to write. You write your new transformation and you plop it into this model, and then all of a sudden you have a working model. Your model stays the same and it works, and it's not a situation where you have to throw everything out every time the next latest and greatest digital format comes up. So That's the advantages of the single source model in abstract. I wanted to show how O'Reilly is implementing the single source model in practice. Good, it's all showing up on the screen because it looks like a little bit of the bottom is getting cut off. So we either start with AsciiDoc or DocBook. AsciiDoc is optional. If we start with AsciiDoc, as part of the toolchain, we automatically convert it to DocBook. Otherwise, we start with DocBook. So I have the sources in pink there. And then from there, we run transformations to get a bunch of different outputs. If we want to make an EPUB, we take the DocBook XSL style sheets. XSLT is a transformation language that can turn one flavor of XML into another. XHTML is a XML compliant version of HTML, and that is one flavor of XML. So if you have XML, you can make HTML. And the awesome thing about HTML is that it is at the core of EPUB. EPUB is basically an archive of HTML files. HTML is obviously the language of the web. A Mobi file is basically Amazon's own packaged container format for HTML as well. So we can take that DocBook XML, we can convert it with XSLT style sheets to EPUB. We can make PDF from that DocBook XML, and the way we do that is that we take our DocBook XML and we run XSLT style sheets and we generate HTML5 for that. And HTML5 is not the ultimate destination. We then take HTML5 and we combine it with CSS, so that's the presentation and formatting aspect of it. And we run it through a proprietary tool that we purchased called Antenna House. And what Antenna House can do is it can take HTML5 content and CSS content, and it can generate a PDF from that. And what's really, really cool is that we have two versions of our CSS for PDF. We can take the same semantic content and we can apply two different kinds of styling to it. So for the print PDF, we have a certain kind of styling that puts, say, hyperlinks in black and displays the URL. For our web PDFs, we hide the URL because in the web PDF, the link is clickable. So we'll make the hyperlink blue, or actually I think we make them red now, and we make them clickable and we hide the URL. So basically, we can tailor the PDF to both print and web by running it through two different sets of CSS in an automated fashion via Antenna House. Another tool for generating PDFs from HTML and CSS is called PrintsXML. So that's another potential option if you're interested in doing this sort of thing. And then thirdly, we can make a Mobi file by taking our DocBook XML, running it through the same DocBook XSL EPUB style sheets. We get an EPUB out. We found that Amazon's Kindle generating program, Amazon has a proprietary program that they provide called KindleGen for producing Mobi output from EPUB output, which they basically require you to use if you want to sell your content in the Kindle store. Or you can send your EPUBs to them and they'll do it for you. But if you care about what the ultimate product is going to look like, you'll probably want to do it yourself. So basically, you'll take that, what we do, because we found that Amazon doesn't like our EPUBs and they don't render very well on Mobi, on the Kindle to start, is we'll then take our EPUBs, run them through another set of custom XSL, and make a Mobi-ready EPUB from that, and then generate a Mobi from that using KindleGen. So I made this slide and I made this flowchart and I said, oh my goodness, this looks really complex. And I'm like, am I really advocating to set up something that complex? And I thought about it some more and I said, I think, yes, I really am, because the goal of this is that every single piece of this is automated. Our production staff doesn't have to understand this whole workflow and this whole flow chart. They run 3 scripts that do this. They run a script called CSS PDF that generates the PDF, or DB to PDF that generates the PDF. They run a different script that the DB to EPUB to create an EPUB. And then we have another script that generates Mobi. So basically, all of this stuff is just the inner workings. And if you take the time to build a really great tool chain, then you get all the benefits and you get it in an automated fashion. When O'Reilly makes EPUBs and Mobis and PDFs to sell in our ebook bundles, we don't send InDesign files to a vendor to make the EPUB and Mobi. We take our DocBook source content and we generate these files in 30 seconds to a minute, depending on the size of the book. That means that, number one, we control the output, we control the styling, we know what we're going to get because we run it through our own tool chain, which we've spent years and years perfecting and testing. We're not sending it out to an outside vendor to do all this stuff for us and hope they did a good job. So we're not going to have a casual vacancy situation like J.K. Rowling's book had, because we know our tool chain and we own our tool chain. And we did all this in an automated fashion. We did it quick. We got these files up for sale really, really fast. We don't need to play games where we want the ebook to come out at the same time as the print book, but because the conversion vendor is going to take 2 weeks to do something, we decide to send the files to the vendor for conversion to digital before the proofread was complete. The exact same content is being used to generate the print content and the digital content. And we wanted to make this even more simple, so I alluded to our Atlas developing and writing platform. We decided to build a UI for that, for building ebooks. So basically, the way we now build ebooks is we don't even run scripts anymore. We basically say we first pick the ebook formats that we want to build. Number 2, we select the chapters we want to put in that ebook. And number 3, we click a build button. And that's how we generate EPUB, MOBI, and PDF. And what's awesome about this is we're exposing this tool chain to our authors. So authors, as they're writing their book, they are generating the final output formats themselves and getting to see what they will look like. And that actually allows us to leverage the authors to fix their own formatting mistakes before the book even comes into production. Because if an author is writing in a format like Microsoft Word and they're mistagging a lot of stuff, they don't know what the final output is going to look like, and they don't realize the mistakes they're going to make. If they write a bunch of ASCII doc and then they click build PDF and the PDF comes out and it looks crazy, they're like, oh wait, I did something wrong. And they either go back and try and figure out what it is and fix it themselves, or they complain and they tell us. And they're like, what's wrong with your system? Why is it making really crappy ebooks? And we say, let's take a look. Oh, you made a mistake. And we fix their mistake when they're writing chapter 2, not after they've written 12 chapters and handed over to us. So not only are we giving them the huge benefit of getting to see this stuff in advance, which gets them really excited, but it helps us head off problems at the pass really early on. So that is the build system, and that is my pitch for single source. Number 4, automate your headaches away. I think the simplest way I can make this point was with the next slide, which is that in 1776, we did not have the option to automate manuscript edits. In 2012, we do. We have these computers, we have this technology, we can do this stuff. And I'm not advocating we do it with a wind-up robot, but there are cool ways that we can do this sort of stuff. So there are some tools for scripting Word documents, and I bet a lot of you guys use them already. The easiest one is probably macros. If you're familiar with macros, it's basically built-in support for automating repetitive tasks. So Word will allow you to go to a macros bar, click record, do a bunch of stuff in a Word document, and save it as a macro, and you can do it over and over again and repeat it. So if you had to style a bunch of stuff as italic or whatever, you could make a macro for doing that, and then just click that macro every time you wanted to do that. 2 other tools for scripting Word documents. Most versions of Word come with built-in support for Visual Basic, which is a programming language, which you can use to basically write more advanced macros, real scripts that you can use programming logic in to script changes to Word documents. And the third option is Windows PowerShell, which is basically a command line scripting type stuff. So if you're really into doing stuff on the command line and writing scripts, you might want to take that PowerShell approach. So those are 3 ways to do it. But I think another reason I really want to advocate using a semantic markup language is it really opens up way more options. So the second you got plain text instead of a Word.doc document, you have so many options to choose from. And I just listed some that O'Reilly uses internally. You could write scripts in Ruby, you can write scripts in Python, Perl, Java. You have the full suite of XML technologies at your disposal to edit and automate XML edits. XPath, XSLT, XQuery. You have JavaScript, you have regular expressions, you have plain text editors and the functions they support, like Emacs and VI. And you have sed, which is another regular expression processor, and many, many more. We use all of these tools, and the cool thing about it is, like, we're not saying if you're doing stuff with Microsoft Word, you're stuck writing VB. You know, we have developers who really like Python. We have developers that really like Ruby. We even have developers that like Perl. Which is a joke for people in the programming world. And if you like Perl, I like it too. So I'm not too dismissive. So there's just so many options, and there's so many choices at your disposal, and there's really the flexibility if you're a developer who's automating this stuff for a publisher to really do things in a cool way that you want to do them. But I wanted to show the power of automation. So I put together a couple slides that I'm calling Fix My Manuscript with One Line of Code. So what I've imagined is some possibly typical requests that we might get from the editorial department down to the production department of changes that they would like made. So request number 1, in the important scientific article below, please change all superscripts to subscripts and accept in informal equation elements. So it looks like a little bit of the bottom got cut off there, but what I've shown on the left is the DocBook XML representation, and what's on the right is the PDF output. And if it's visible, you'll see that the problem with this is this great scientific author has used superscripts when they should have used subscripts. So how would we fix that? Well, one way you could fix it is you could literally go in and you could change every instance of a superscript to a subscript by manually editing the XML source, or if it were a Word file, manually editing the Word file. Perhaps you're also thinking, oh, well, I can do a find and replace, and I can find every tag that is a superscript and change it to a subscript using some sort of find and replace algorithm. That's fine, but the problem here is that the request is a little more specific. This time, this author actually did get the subscripts correct and the superscripts correct in equation elements. So it's only in body text. So we need something a little more sophisticated. So to pick just one technology we could use to solve this problem, XPath comes to the rescue. So I know this is getting a little bit technical, but I wanted to illustrate the point that, like, you can do these things and you can have people to learn these languages, or you can learn them yourself. So I just wanted to outline, a little bit how it works. And basically, you can use a command line tool called XML Starlet to edit your XML, and you can use that to make an edit. And then you supply something called an XPath, which is a representation of the content hierarchically. So basically what that's saying is find all superscripts, and then the stuff in brackets is what's called a predicate, and that says that meets certain conditions. So we want to find all superscripts that do not have an ancestor. An ancestor means something higher up in the hierarchy, so that don't have as their parent an informal equation. So you do that, and then you say, what do you want to substitute that with? And you want to substitute that with subscript. And then all of a sudden, you'll see that those changes are all set. So you wrote one line of code, and you fixed a problem throughout your entire book. And the best part is, because you wrote that one line of code, you can use it again. So the next time that you have a really bad author, and I hope there aren't scientific journals that have authors that are making that mistake over and over again, you can re-automate and reuse your code. So you might think, well, it took me 20 minutes to write that section of code, and it would have taken me 15 minutes to fix every instance manually myself. I used to fall into this trap all the time as a production staff person. I'll just spend the 15 minutes up front, fix the problems, and then we're good. Except that 2 weeks later, you get the same problem again, and you spent that 15 minutes again. You now spent 30 minutes, whereas if you had spent the 20 minutes up front to write the code, you just run the code again, and you're ahead by 10 minutes. And you imagine that if you're at a publisher, you're seeing the same problems over and over and over again. It really, really pays to put the effort into development of these sort of tools. So that's example one. I also wanted to do an AsciiDoc example. So request number 2, house style for dates is in the format year followed by month followed by date. But in the manuscript below, they were done month, day, year. Can you please fix that? Again, you could go into that table and you could fix every single one of those dates. or you could write a script that would do it for you. So I'm using something in this script that I've written called regex, which is sort of a shorthand for regular expressions. Regular expressions is a pattern matching language. So it's basically like find and replace on steroids. Instead of finding and replacing for specific words, you can find and replace for specific patterns. So it looks really, really gnarly because it's just a jumble of numbers and symbols. But if you take the time to learn regular expressions, it'll pay off huge dividends. So basically what I'm doing here is I'm using Perl actually, which has really great regular expression processing capabilities. And I'm running a Perl script, and I'm saying do a substitution. And basically what I'm doing here is I'm capturing each portion of the date. I'm saying, okay, capture first the month, second the date, third the year. And then take those three things and reorder them in the order I want them ordered in, only this time use hyphens to separate them instead of slashes. So you do that, and you run that script, and you fixed all the dates. And in fairness, I was able to write a more simple regular expression than I might have been able to if the dates were because all the dates were formatted already consistently in the wrong way. You might have had to write something more sophisticated if some of the dates were year, month, day, and some of them were the other way, and you wanted to account for those sort of possibilities. But the great thing is not only can you write these scripts to do it yourself, but a lot of this stuff already exists out there on the web, so you can take advantage of it. So that's my pitch for automation, and I'm going to move on to the next section, which is versioning is the new spell check. So what I mean by that is it's sort of unthinkable that you would be writing in a word processor that doesn't have spell check in today's modern day and age. You know, it's become sort of a matter of course that if you're going to be doing manuscript editing, that you want a spell checker to fix those errors for you. I feel that versioning is something that is equally as important. But to sort of make that point, I want to ask two questions about your ebook's editorial life cycle, your book or ebook's editorial life cycle. Number one, will more than one person be working on the manuscript files? Number two, will there be more than one draft of the manuscript? If you answered yes to either of these questions, you need a version control system. You absolutely need it. You need a way to track what different revisions are and who's done what work. And the thing is, you may say, I don't need a version control system. I know what I'm doing. And effectively, you may have a version control system already. This may be your version control system. So the key feature number one of version control is what I'm calling revision snapshots, basically keeping track of different drafts and different levels of it. So maybe your system is that you number each chapter, and then when somebody makes edits, you put their initials in that file, and maybe you put a date in it. Maybe you have color coding as part of your system, and green means something that's gone through tech review, and red means something that's really screwed up. My absolute favorite is maybe you append underscore final to something when you're like it's all done, and then wait, it's not all done, so you add final again, and you have a file that's called chapter 01 underscore final underscore final. How many of you have files that are underscore final underscore final? I do too, right? It's crazy. That's really, really messed up. That tells you, you groan when you do it. You've all had it, right? And you're like, this is really just a bummer. Like, can this possibly be how I'm tracking things? If you have final, which I've seen before too, that's really, really bad. So that's feature one, managing revision snapshots. Feature two is something I'm calling diffing. And that's a really, really inside circle programming term, which is basically like the difference between two sets of files. The way Microsoft Word handles diffing is they call it track changes. And I think any publisher who uses Microsoft Word relies really heavily on track changes. So for an example of track changes, I've taken the opener of A Tale of Two Cities and I've copy edited it. And you can see that my copy edits there are all tracked, and you can see the stuff that I've deleted, the additions that I've made, and I've made some comments on the right. But there's two problems with this. One is that it's really hard to read. So you can turn off tracking changes, but then you can't see the differences anymore. And it's a bit of a mess. And two is it only gives you two levels of changes. You can only track the old way and the new way. What if you want to track the way it was after the author made the edits, after the copy editor made their edits, and after the production editor made their edits? You can't really, there's not a good way to cover three levels of edits and track them all. So the question I would ask is, what if we version manuscripts like software developers version code? What if we took, because software developers have solved these problems, because in code, it is absolutely critical to solve these problems, to figure out where code has gone wrong, what changes have been made, who's done what. When you're working on an open source code project, there can be dozens, even hundreds of people working on it. So I think one of the most exciting tools that's come around in the past decade for programmers to solve these problems is something called GitHub. And GitHub is a website which allows you to post code repositories, sections of code that you have edited and that people are working on, and track changes in them. But one thing that we've really seen at O'Reilly is that authors, and this is something authors have done, this isn't something that we've imposed on authors, authors were taking their book content and putting it in GitHub themselves and saying, what if I took my manuscript and pretended it was code and took advantage of GitHub's versioning tools? So an example of this is actually not an O'Reilly book. It's a book called ProGit. So GitHub uses a version control system, a program called Git, and one of the key people at GitHub named Scott Chacon wrote a book about Git for A Press called ProGit. And in addition to selling this book in Amazon, he made this book available for free online, and he put it in a GitHub repo. And he said, here world, have access to my book in GitHub. And what happened is all these different people just started chiming in and editing his book and making it better and fixing typos and doing all kinds of crazy stuff with it. And GitHub can support that. So you can see here, and I hope it's visible. I know the slide's a little bit blurry, but basically a bunch of different people have made changes to it. They tag each change with what's called a commit message, which is basically like a log where they describe what they did. And by just looking at this commits tab in GitHub, you can see who made changes when and a description of what they did. And if you want more than just a description of what they did, you want to granularly see like literally what they changed, this is how GitHub handles diffing. It shows in red the changes that were deleted and green the changes that were added. So this was just a snapshot of a small set of changes that were made a few days ago in this GitHub repo by some person who, independently of Scott Chacon, independently of A Press, as far as I know, decided, I want to work on the Portuguese translation of this book. And what he did is he just went in and started translating the book to Portuguese. And he and a bunch of other people are working on translating this book into Portuguese. And if you go and look at this book in GitHub, it's been translated into, I believe, something like 30 languages just by people doing it themselves. So that's obviously a virtue of putting stuff out there publicly. But the point I wanted to make is that GitHub is robust enough to handle hundreds and hundreds of contributors all working independently, not communicating with each other, just doing stuff they think is cool and worth doing and needs to be done. They're making all those edits themselves on their own. And as a result of that, GitHub is sophisticated enough as a tool to track these changes, to do revision snapshots, and to do this diffing that what results is actually a great final product and not a mess. So that is what you get if you're willing to take a look into versioning that way. So the last point I want to talk about a little bit, and I'm going to go through this relatively briefly because Adam covered a lot of this stuff too in his presentation. But it's new medium equals new dimensionality. You know, you're not just writing a print book anymore. You know, there's a different, and the second point I want to make is there's a real difference between a digitized text and a digital text. When I say something is a digitized text, that means in my mind that this is digital last. That someone has said, let's make a print book and then get it converted to an ebook. Something that's a digital text is what I'm going to say is digital first. Let's make an ebook. Irrespective of a print book, let's make an ebook. Maybe we'll make a print book, maybe we won't, but the digital book needs to be considered first. So I think there are 4 key principles that I want to talk about what digital first looks like. Interactivity, audio-video, intertextuality, and intratextuality/navigation. By interactivity, I mean something that actually actively engages with the reader of the book, that they're not a passive consumer of the content. So an example is something that I made myself for a project I'm working on called HTML5 for Publishers. And it's a quadratic equation solver. And the link right there up there is where you could try it out yourself if you want to. But basically what it is, and it works on the iPad, and it'll also work on the web and potentially other e-readers if they actually support the JavaScript I need to make this work, is basically it allows you to input values for A, B, and C in a quadratic equation, and then on the fly it will output the actual solutions to the quadratic equation. So rather than just telling readers this is the quadratic formula and here's how you use it, you can let them play around and enter numbers into it themselves and see their results on the fly. So that's just like one simple example of interactivity. There's all kinds of cool stuff you can do with HTML5 Canvas in terms of making interactive animations, games, all kinds of crazy stuff. The second thing, when publishers talk about doing enhanced ebooks, I think they almost always are doing stuff with audio and video because I think that's like really low-hanging fruit. And I think in a certain sense, it's really, it feels less daunting and it feels less, I guess what I'm trying to say is, it's in certain ways it's sort of less forward thinking. It's like, it's not new media really. It's like, well, it's like doing a video of someone, like making a TV show and embedding it in your book, or taking an interview with somebody and embedding it in the book. Audio and video publishers get because audio and video have already been done in radio and television. They're very old media, I think, in a certain sense. So I think that's why they're largely low-hanging fruit. So, an example of what a lot of publishers I think are doing is taking maybe an interview with the author or embedding it in the book, or, if it's a children's book, maybe they'll put some video in there related to that. But an example that I have that I did for HTML5 for Publishers about doing audio was a talking glossary. So like, what if in addition to the glossary at the back of the book, you not only showed the definitions of the words, but you actually hit a button so that people could have the words pronounced and spoken to them? This is something that's really easy. And why wouldn't you do this in a digital book? If you've made an ebook that's supposed to teach somebody a foreign language and there's no audio in the book, what are you doing, right? I mean, you need audio to teach somebody a different language. So I think that's the kind of thing you should be thinking about when you make digital books. It's like, what is your goal? What are you trying to accomplish? And how can technology help you? But I think those two, the kind of things with interactivity and audio video is that it requires a lot of development work. What I think publishers are missing is there are a lot of simple ways to make a next generation digital book that's, that takes advantage of the digital medium without spending hours and hours taking audio or video or programming. And one of them is what I'm calling intertextuality. Be a part of the web. Because you're digital and because most e-readers have internet access, you need to think about the fact that your book can be connected to the web. So as an example of this, I took an excerpt from an O'Reilly book called Hackers, which is a really awesome book written by Stephen Levy that sort of talks about all the cool stuff that computer hackers have been doing in the positive sense. People who are hacking to do really cool projects and bring about awesome things. Have done in the past 30 years to move technology forward. But what's cool about this book is that we thought about what a digital version of this book could really offer people. And one thing is that there's a whole cast of characters who are featured in the book. And in the introduction of that book, we list all those characters and give a 2-sentence description of them. But these people live on the web too. They either have their own websites, or they're prominent enough that they have Wikipedia pages, or there have been great news articles written about them. Why not turn each person's name into a clickable link and have somebody be able to click on that person's name and get more information if they want to hear more about them? This doesn't require a whole lot of programming. This doesn't require a whole lot of development effort. This is something, we had an editor do as a side project on and off for a few days. Just went in and said, what if we made all of this stuff into links? What if when reading a book, anytime people wanted to hear more about something that we weren't talking about in depth, they could click a link and be taken right there? So, a print book is effectively siloed. The best you can do is put a bibliography, put footnotes, put a glossary in it, and say, if you want more information, go find these resources. In a digital book, we can do better. We don't need to even have a bibliography or a glossary. We can instead just have you go and click on this stuff and be taken right there instantaneously. Why aren't we doing that? I think that's really easy and it should be done. And the last one is what I'm calling intratextuality, the textuality internal to the book. And as an example of this, I wanted to show just an excerpt of an index that we've put in a digital book. And I think indexes are one of the things that are gotten wrong an awful lot in ebooks. The way indexes work in print books, right, is you go to the back in the index, it gives you a list of terms that are used in the book, and it gives you a page number to go get them. If you do that in a digital book, you're sunk, because the page numbers are meaningless. Those pages don't exist anymore in a reflowable context. So if you tell people that there's more information about Python, the programming language, on page 33, and Kindle doesn't use page numbers, it uses location numbers like 3,462, you're not going to be able to find it. That's no good. And I've seen a lot of indexes in ebooks where they just convert the print index digitally to a digital book and keep those page numbers in there. We thought a lot at O'Reilly about what we could best do about that. And our solution is that every index entry has hyperlinks after it. The hyperlinks have the name of the section that contains the content. And when you click on those hyperlinks, they take you to the exact portion of the text where the term is. So again, this is something that if you set up your toolchain right, the DocBook toolchain does all this stuff automatically. I didn't have to write any code to do this. It just did it. So the only innovation that we have is that we put a note on the digital index at the top. And maybe we won't have to do this 10 years from now, but we put a note at the top that explains why there are no page numbers in this index and how you can navigate it. And that's just, it's digital first. It's just thinking about this as like, how is somebody going to read a digital text? Let's make sure there are no artifacts that are really print only in my digital book. So that's all I had on that. And I actually thought that I would go through this quicker than I did. So I wanted to leave time for questions and to talk about any of this stuff a bit more. I think we still have a few minutes for questions. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, in the front. Mm-hmm. Awesome. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How do you represent that?
It's a real problem, and I did mention that DocBook is probably not the right tool for doing semantic markup for a poem. DocBook has an element called literal layout, which basically says any text you include in this element represent literally. So in DocBook, that means that any white space in that element is significant and should be preserved, whereas in most XML vocabularies, it gets normalized to one space or whatever. No. Semantically, I don't think I would love for HTML to have like a really great semantic representation, explanation of like literal layout or something equivalent. The closest is probably something called the pre-tag, which means pre-formatted. So what we would do at O'Reilly for poems, and occasionally this comes up because oftentimes authors will do epigraphs, little quotes at the beginning of their text that are actually poetry excerpts. We'll use the pre-tag and then we'll use CSS to say things like no wrap and make sure you do this or that. It's a real problem in that, if e-readers don't support it the way you want, you may not get the results you want. I think we're fortunate enough that we're not in the poetry book business, that this is somewhat of an outlier for us. But at the same time, we deal with this problem all the time in that all of our books contain tons of code. And white space is really significant in a lot of different programming languages. So, we use the pre-tag. We make sure that the CSS is specified. We actually don't use no wrap on code because this is a huge problem, and I'd love to hear other people's solutions on this particular problem. Like if we didn't wrap our code lines when people read our books on the iPhone, they just get cut off. So we do use wrap. But unfortunately what that means is that like a code listing may be harder to read on an iPhone because you can't see where the real line breaks are and where it's just wrapping. So yeah, it's a tricky problem.
I think that's outside of just
Mhm,
people.
mhm,
And
mhm.
there's no
Yeah, I think that's more of a Kindle problem than a semantic problem because like in DocBook there's an element called sidebar that says this is an aside. I think that's a problem that potentially might be solvable on the Kindle Fire or a device that supports more sophisticated HTML and CSS. You could potentially use absolute positioning and do some stuff to get two columns.
then you're on.
Yeah, it's tough. Yeah. Yes. A little bit. So O'Reilly has this conference called Tools of Change, which we run. Our flagship Tools of Change conference is run in New York City in February every year, and I'm sure some of you have probably been to it. But we also run smaller TOC type events in various different locations. We have one in Charleston, South Carolina later in the year. So going to those, I do have an opportunity to talk to a lot of people who are doing in similar roles at other publishing companies. And I've seen a marked increase in number of people who are doing things more like this. When I went 2 years ago, I didn't hear a whole lot about it. When I gave a talk last year, I had people coming up to me and saying, "You're doing exactly what I'm doing. Can we talk?" And I was like, "That's really awesome." One thing I've seen is I think it's a lot of the smaller publishers who are really engaged in this sort of innovation because I think they have more to lose by this. They don't have this huge conglomerate backing them, and they don't have a ton of money to be throwing at conversion vendors here, there, and everywhere. And because they're also smaller and more nimble, they potentially aren't burdened by bureaucracy in terms of being able to innovate and try new things. So I've heard a lot from a lot of small publishers who are looking at XML and CSS-based workflows. I think larger publishers are getting the message. I'm not sure if that's actually what they're doing. It's hard when, you can just quickly throw money at the problem by just sending to a conversion vendor. It's hard to really make those huge investments in infrastructure changes. Yeah, in the blue? Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I think the first thing to respond to that is like when you're doing digital only and you're doing all this interactive stuff, you have to think about it in terms of what I'll call fallbacks, about how to make sure that the experience is not so dependent on these interactive things that it isn't degraded for people that don't have them. So taking the example of a Kindle Fire that can support all kinds of color and fancy CSS and regular Kindle, it's a challenge for publishers. We try and strike a balance between pursuing innovations that are helpful without degrading quality. So, I think the challenge is to make sure you're not taking a lowest common denominator approach and not saying, well, 80% of our customers read on the Kindle, so we're just going to make sure something looks good on the Kindle, and if it looks good on the Kindle, that's good enough for everywhere else. So I think that's the answer to your second question. The first question, which I'm really glad you brought up, is a larger question about what we call accessibility in the publishing industry, which is making sure that people with all kinds of disabilities or limitations can get the most out of books. So one thing we're actually trying to pursue more and more is something called alt text, which in HTML it's actually called an alt attribute, ALT. But basically what it means is you provide alternative textual descriptions for visual elements. So we're trying really hard, and there's an internal push to make sure that authors for all images can really supply alternative textual descriptions that say what's in the image. So that if someone is vision impaired, or maybe they're just using a device that can't even show images, although most modern e-readers can totally do that, but also potentially for video and things like that, that there are textual descriptions that people can have access to. Something neither I nor Adam really talked about at all, but it's something that O'Reilly does, is that we provide an additional format in our ebook bundles called Daisy, which is the digital talking book version of our books. So that's a format that's maintained by the Daisy Consortium, I believe it is, and Adam will correct me if I'm wrong about that. But basically, it's a standard format for text-to-speech. So there are all these hardware e-readers out there that people with vision impairments can have, that they can use to basically have the book spoken to them. Yeah, in the back, right there. Yeah, you. Mm-hmm.
I have a question,
Mm-hmm.
particularly on the web page.
Mm-hmm.
To their numbers, back to the book.
That's a really great question. I think that also gets to a question that was asked to Adam about archiving content and internet connectivity and all that sort of stuff. So HTML5 has a technology called local storage, which basically enables you to store data like that. The biggest challenge in terms of ebooks is even the most advanced e-readers like iBooks and stuff have really limited capabilities surrounding that. So I think a lot of the answer is sort of like right now, not really. But if you're doing this on the web, you could totally do that, I think. And there's also technologies like cookies and things like that on the web, and session variables that can be used to store data in a persistent fashion. I had, this is an interesting anecdote. I had somebody write to me who had read a book I wrote called HTML5 for Publishers, that he wanted to make a digital yearbook for his students in his high school. He was a high school teacher, and he wanted to make a digital iPad version of his yearbook for students to pass around. And he said to me, what would be really awesome is if there was a way that students could sign the digital yearbook in such a way that those signatures could be preserved. Can I do that? And I was like, I don't think so right now. And for my own personal experimentation, I'm not sure there's a way that you could totally have somebody sign the book, but to have them close the book and open it 3 days from then and still see it, I don't think that's possible right now, at least not on the iPad. But I'd be willing to bet that 5 years from now, these sort of problems will be solved, especially if things move toward more open formats like the web. Yeah, you in the hat on the upper left.
Yeah, basically, if anyone's going to do it, all right.
I guess my answer, to be honest, would be like yes and no. Have we done that? So I guess, the first thing that came to my mind when you said that is, I think when we talk outside O'Reilly to other folks, we talk about something called our tool chain, as if it's this sort of monolithic thing that does all these magical things for us. But when you break it down, like you were basically suggesting, our tool chain is basically a bundling up of a bunch of different scripts and different programming languages and different commands and different tools to create that larger superstructure that I showed you in that one slide that showed the workflow. So I think we've been very open in terms of blogging about how we do things. Most portions of our tool chain are open source to some degree and are built on open source tools. So in that sense, I think it's pretty easy for someone who's really sophisticated in this stuff to go and basically replicate a lot of the pieces of what we've done. Have we taken it to the degree of which we've actually built a full program that does all that stuff and made it available to people? Again, the answer is sort of yes and no. So I showed a couple slides from something called our Atlas platform, which is a beta project that we have in development right now, which is basically a full-fledged ebook tool chain that basically allows people to author in that and take advantage of our build infrastructure and build this content. So we're building tools like that, and I think in the future you're going to hear and see a lot more from us on that front. But I acknowledge that we haven't done a whole lot of that yet. I should also acknowledge that we're not the only ones doing these things. Adam's right when he says that there's a huge startup culture around this stuff. And I'm sure you've heard of things like Vook, which is another startup that is basically enabling authors to write and produce EPUB and Mobi and send them to the Kindle store. Almost, it seems like every week I hear about a brand new startup, about a brand new content management system for authors to write and develop content. I think because a lot of publishers haven't solved these problems themselves, there's a lot of people who are lining up to solve those problems for other people. And I think it'll be interesting to see in the next few years how that shakes out. And I hope and believe that O'Reilly will be a huge part of that. Okay, yes, again.
So you,
Mm-hmm.
and then about interactivity, like having a
Mm-hmm.
so ideally you have
Yes.
how do you manage
That's definitely the most challenging part of my job, and I spend a lot of time trying to sort that out in my head, the best way to do that. There's lots of tools that exist. To take a more simple example, to start simpler, CSS3 supports media queries, which basically say, okay, and a lot of certain e-readers support media queries to different degrees. Kindle, which basically we asked them for this and they gave it to us, and it's really saved us a lot. They support media queries to distinguish styling for e-ink devices and the color tablets. So basically it enables us to do two different sets of CSS to make sure that we take advantage of the Kindle Fire without screwing over the Kindle e-ink.
that's more of a layout
Yeah.
actually
Interactivity and things like that are trickier. Basically, the way we're handling that stuff right now, and we're still working on this, and it's a big challenge, is we're doing stuff with fallbacks. So for example, when DocBook has a concept of something called a media object, which can store images or videos or all that stuff. So basically what we're doing for video now is that we're saying, okay, for every video that we want to have, we're going to also have an image fallback. And for devices that support the video will be displayed. And for devices that don't support video but do support images, we'll display images. And potentially we could even fall back to text for devices that don't support images. So we build into the tool chain stuff that's smart enough to say, okay, if this is for Mobi, do the image because Kindle e-ink is not going to support a video. If this is something going to the web, display the video. So video is probably an easier one to solve than things like the quadratic equation solver. The way I imagine we'll continue to solve interactive things is like we'll have logic that says, well, the fallback is just to display the quadratic formula and say, oftentimes another thing we're doing is we're putting hyperlinks to the web. So interactive stuff we'll host on the web. What's sort of ironic and sad is certain e-reader devices have better renderings in the web browsers embedded on the tablets than in the actual e-reader applications. So for example, I wrote this short book called HTML5 for Publishers, and within the e-reader, the embedded HTML5 canvas examples don't work. But if you click a hyperlink to where I posted the exact same examples on the web browser on the Nook will display them just fine. So I think that's the way we're solving things. We're trying to do as intelligent fallbacks as possible and giving web URLs when not. I think this is another huge benefit of going toward the web, because if we go to the web, we don't have to do that hyperlink bit. Yes. Depends on the cases, and depends on what you're trying to do. If you include CSS that isn't supported, it just won't do anything. The problem, I think, is in situations where different stuff is relying on different stuff. So if if this piece works but that piece doesn't work, it causes a rendering mishap or something like that. So that's potentially a problem. In general, you're right though that like if you put HTML5 tags in an e-reader that doesn't support those HTML5 tags, the tags will just get dropped. It could be a problem though if like you're trying to style those same things with CSS or something. It's one of the things that makes this job really difficult, that a huge component that I didn't talk about at all is QA, is taking that same EPUB and putting it in every e-reader possible that we can and seeing what happens. And we do that a lot, and it's my least favorite part of the job, and I find it really, really unpleasant and depressing. And oftentimes it forces us to make really tough decisions, like we desperately want to do this stuff and it looks beautiful on the iPad, but the Sony reader just can't handle it and it'll screw something up, which is where being a direct-to-customer publisher really helps us, because what we can then do is we have customer feedback surveys, and the questions we ask them are, what e-readers do you use to read our books? And based on that, we can get, we don't hear back from everybody, but we can get an estimate of what people are actually reading and on what. So we've determined that not enough of our customers are using the Sony reader, then we don't have to worry as much about supporting it. It's a huge problem too, because we've now reached a point where the Kindle's been around since 2007. Like the Kindle 1 is a Neanderthal compared to the Kindle 3 Homo sapien. So like people who have the latest Kindles are going to get a much better experience than people who have really old Kindles. At a certain point, we just have to make a judgment call. It's like how many people are still using the Kindle 1 and things like that. Okay, I'll be around.